I didn't expect my friend's aunt to sit in my lap, or say, "You're not going anywhere." And suddenly, everything changed. It started as an ordinary afternoon at my friend's apartment, a lazy Saturday, sunlight streaming through half-open blinds, casting soft patterns across the floor. I wasn't expecting anything remarkable, just a quiet hangout with familiar faces. But then she appeared. My friend's aunt, someone I'd seen only in passing at family gatherings, never close enough to notice the subtleties that suddenly made her impossible to ignore. She moved with a quiet confidence, not flashy but deliberate, like someone entirely comfortable in their own skin. The way her shoulders relaxed as she laughed, the gentle tilt of her head when she listened, it was magnetic. I caught the faint glimmer of gold in her hair, strands illuminated by the sun, and wondered how something so simple could seem so captivating. Her presence filled the room in a way I didn't realize a person could, not through volume, but through a calm warmth that made it hard to look anywhere else. As she passed, her scarf brushed lightly against my arm, a fleeting contact, almost accidental, but enough to send a ripple through me. The fabric was soft, carrying a subtle scent of jasmine and something uniquely her. I blinked, half surprised by the intimacy of such a small, accidental touch. She smiled, just the corners of her lips turning up, eyes warm and inviting, and it felt like recognition, even though we barely knew each other. I noticed details I'd never paid attention to before, the delicate curve of her hand as she gestured, the faint calluses on her fingers hinting at years of experience, and the small silver bracelet that jingled softly when she moved. She spoke in a voice that was low and steady, with just the right amount of humor, and every word seemed to linger in the air longer than it should. Even the way she sipped her tea, slow, deliberate, felt intimate somehow, as if I were seeing a side of her the world didn't often notice. There was an ease in her vulnerability, too, hidden beneath the confidence. A slight hesitation when she laughed at one of my jokes, a quiet glance to see if I was watching her, moments that made me realize she wasn't just graceful, she was human. Fully human, with all the depth and nuance that drew people in without demanding attention. I tried to focus on the conversation, on the casual jokes my friends were making, but my attention kept drifting back to her. I was aware of every subtle movement, every small inflection in her voice, every glance that seemed to linger just a little too long to be accidental. It was the beginning of noticing someone, not superficially, but in the way you remember tiny details because they've made a mark before even saying a word. By the time the afternoon drifted on, I realized something strange was happening. She had completely unsettled me, in the best possible way. There was curiosity, yes, but also an inexplicable warmth, a pull that made the room feel different. Ordinary moments suddenly carried weight, and I found myself wondering if she noticed how aware I was of her, or if she was simply as naturally magnetic as she seemed. And in that quiet, sunlit room, the first spark was lit. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew it would matter. A few days later, I found myself back at my friend's place, this time for a casual game night. The room smelled faintly of popcorn and the lingering warmth of the sun outside, and the atmosphere was light-hearted, full of laughter and teasing. I thought I'd be focused on the game, but of course she was there again, my friend's aunt, gliding into the space with that same quiet confidence that seemed to slow down everything around her. We ended up sitting on the same couch, not deliberately, just because there weren't enough seats. I tried to act casual, keeping my attention on the game, but I couldn't ignore the subtle closeness. Her arm brushed against mine as she reached for the dice. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet I felt a spark, a warmth that traveled up my arm and lingered long after her fingers pulled back. The couch was small, and even without meaning to, our knees touched lightly. My heart thumped faster, yet the feeling was strangely comforting, like I was exactly where I was meant to be. She leaned forward to point something out on the game board, her hair falling in front of her face. I instinctively reached up to tuck it behind her ear, and our eyes met. There was a flicker there, something unspoken, a quiet acknowledgement of awareness. It wasn't romantic confession, not yet, but it carried a subtle tension, playful and teasing. The kind that makes the air between two people feel charged without a single word being spoken. She laughed softly at something one of my friends said, and I caught the way her hand lingered near mine on the couch cushion. Not touching, not pressing, just close enough for the warmth of proximity to make me aware of her. The smell of her perfume, something soft, floral, familiar, mixed with the buttery scent of popcorn, and I realized I was memorizing these tiny details without even trying. Her gaze kept finding mine, playful, curious, and yet carefully measured. At one point, she shifted slightly, and our shoulders pressed together. It wasn't a conscious act of intimacy, but it was intimate nonetheless. I felt the heat of her body, the slight brush of her arm, and I was acutely aware of the rhythm of her breathing. It was grounding, and yet it made my pulse quicken. I wanted to retreat, to remind myself of boundaries, but the pull of her presence made that impossible. We ended up joking and teasing each other in quiet moments between the game's rounds. Our banter was gentle, flirtatious in the way words are when they carry meaning beneath the surface. She'd lean in to whisper something to me, and I'd catch the warmth of her lips near my ear, the soft exhale of her breath. My mind was acutely aware of every brush, every laugh, every subtle movement, how her hand nearly touched mine as she adjusted her position, how her eyes held a spark of mischief that I couldn't look away from. By the end of the evening, I realized something had shifted. It wasn't just the way she moved, the way she laughed, or the way she carried herself. It was the way her presence lingered, making me aware of every small sensation, every brush of skin, every subtle look. The attraction was no longer just a quiet curiosity, it had grown into a simmering tension, unspoken, delicate, and impossible to ignore. That night, as I left, I caught myself replaying the moments, the fleeting touches, the warmth, the way she looked at me with a quiet, playful intensity. And I knew, without realizing it, that this was only the beginning. It was another evening at my friend's place, quieter this time, less laughter, more soft music playing in the background, the kind that makes the air feel warmer and closer. I found myself sitting across from her on the couch, a small coffee table between us, yet somehow the space felt smaller, more intimate. Something in the way she looked at me tonight made me pay attention to the subtleties I'd been missing before. The way her eyes softened when she spoke, the faint crease in her forehead when she paused, like she was measuring her words carefully. She began to share a story about her childhood, about a memory that was bittersweet, funny, yet tinged with something vulnerable. Her voice was low, steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that drew me in. I leaned forward without thinking, fully attentive, because the room had shifted. It was no longer about the game, or the casual gathering, it was about her, and the way she trusted me enough to let me in, even a little. Her hands moved as she spoke, tracing small, invisible patterns on her lap. At one point, a nervous flick of her fingers brushed against mine. It was brief, unintentional, yet electric in a way I couldn't ignore. My chest tightened with a warmth I couldn't name. I wanted to pull back, remind myself of the boundaries, but there was something grounding about that contact, about the unspoken trust it carried. As she spoke, I noticed the subtle details, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the warmth of the room, the way her hair fell in soft waves over one shoulder. When she looked up at me, her eyes held a quiet question, a silent plea for understanding. And I understood. I didn't need words to feel it. There was a vulnerability in her that wasn't weakness, it was human, real, and it made me ache to protect it without smothering it. I found myself mirroring her movements, leaning slightly closer, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The contact was minimal, yet it carried weight. The warmth of her skin, the steadiness of her gaze, the way her fingers lingered near mine as if testing whether it was safe to bridge the distance. I could feel the rhythm of her breathing, subtle but present, matching the quiet tension building between us. At one point, she laughed softly at a shared memory, and the sound seemed to wrap around the space between us, pulling me in. I realized that what had started as fascination was deepening into something more profound. I wasn't just noticing her elegance or beauty, I was noticing her humanity, her quiet strength and tender vulnerability, and how being near her made the world feel softer, warmer, more alive. By the time the evening wound down, there was a subtle shift in the energy between us. It wasn't romantic confession, not yet, but it was something that went deeper than playful glances or casual proximity. It was connection, the kind that lingers, the kind that makes ordinary moments feel extraordinary. I left that night aware of her presence in a way that stayed with me, the memory of her voice, her touch, and the way her eyes had held mine echoing long after I walked away. Something had changed. The spark was growing into a quiet, steady flame, and I knew I was only just beginning to understand the pull she had over me, not just in curiosity, but in heart. It started as an ordinary evening, the kind where conversation flowed easily, laughter lingered in the air, and time seemed to stretch just a little longer. We were sitting in the living room, casually watching an old movie my friend had picked out. The dim glow of the television painted soft shadows across the room, and for some reason, the ordinary seemed charged with possibility. I had no idea she would change the entire dynamic in one unexpected moment. She had been sitting next to me on the couch, her posture relaxed but precise, as if every movement was both effortless and intentional. I tried to focus on the movie, but the warmth of her presence made it impossible. Her shoulder brushed against mine, a fleeting, accidental touch, or so I thought. Then she laughed at something on screen, and it wasn't the usual polite laugh. It was full, unrestrained, her eyes sparkling as they met mine for a heartbeat longer than usual. And then, as if following some unspoken impulse, she shifted. One graceful motion, and suddenly she was seated on my lap. My heart leapt, not out of fear, but out of a curious, exhilarating tension. She didn't move awkwardly or with hesitation. Instead, she rested there as if she belonged, her arms draping lightly around my shoulders. Her weight was warm, comforting, and grounding, yet it sent a thrill through me I couldn't ignore. Her voice was soft but deliberate as she said, "You're not going anywhere." It wasn't a demand, not really, it was teasing, playful, intimate. But the effect it had on me was immediate. My pulse quickened, a rush of awareness sweeping through every nerve in my body. I was acutely conscious of the warmth of her body against mine, the gentle pressure of her legs across my lap, and the subtle rise and fall of her breathing near my chest. I tried to keep my composure, to remind myself of boundaries, but the situation was charged in a way words couldn't contain. Her head leaned slightly against my shoulder, and the scent of her perfume, soft, floral, familiar, enveloped me. I could feel the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat through her chest, hear the faint rustle of her clothing as she shifted slightly, and in that moment, the entire room faded away. Her eyes met mine again, playful yet searching, and I realized the intensity wasn't just in her actions, it was in the silence between us, in the small, deliberate touches that carried unspoken meaning. Her fingers lightly brushed mine as she adjusted her position, and the contact was electric without being invasive. The warmth of her skin against mine lingered, a tangible reminder that this was both real and forbidden in the smallest, most thrilling way. I couldn't speak. Words would have broken the spell. All I could do was remain present, aware of her closeness, feeling both exhilarated and strangely grounded. There was no rush, no overt declaration, just the intimacy of proximity, the thrill of her teasing, and the unspoken understanding that something significant had shifted between us. By the time she slid off my lap, returning to her own space with a small, mischievous smile, the tension lingered like an echo. I knew, without question, that this moment was only the beginning, that our connection had crossed a line from curiosity and admiration into something more profound, something quietly intoxicating. After that evening, I couldn't stop replaying the memory, the warmth of her body on my lap, the soft weight of her arms around my shoulders, her playful voice saying, "You're not going anywhere." It wasn't just a moment, it was a spark that refused to fade, lingering in my chest long after I left my friend's apartment. The next few days were filled with an uneasy mixture of anticipation and doubt. Every time I thought of her, my heart would race, and yet a quiet voice in the back of my mind reminded me of boundaries, of expectations, of the age difference that couldn't be ignored. She was confident, elegant, and worldly in ways I was only beginning to understand. I was young, inexperienced, and naive in comparison, The thought of crossing a line, emotional or otherwise, weighed on me, making the memory both intoxicating and terrifying. I found myself hyper-aware of my surroundings when she was near. A casual touch, a lingering glance, even her laughter drifting from another room sent waves of tension through me. Every small detail mattered, the way her hair fell just so when she leaned forward, the faint scent of her perfume that seemed to follow her, the warmth radiating from her when she spoke. My body remembered everything even when my mind tried to rationalize it away. There was guilt, too, not for her, but for myself. I wondered if I was imagining things, reading too much into casual gestures. Was it attraction? Or just a fleeting moment blown out of proportion by my own longing? I struggled with the difference between desire and respect, between curiosity and the real risk of emotional entanglement. Yet the hesitation wasn't only about morality or social perception. There was fear, the fear of losing something precious if I acted on it too soon, the fear that I could misread her intentions. The memory of her soft, playful gaze and the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat reminded me of the intimacy we had shared, however fleeting. It made me realize that whatever this connection was, it wasn't superficial. There was depth, trust, and unspoken understanding, and that made the stakes feel higher. Every interaction after that first lap moment was tinged with new awareness. I noticed the small ways she communicated, how her eyes lingered a fraction longer when she looked at me, the subtle tilt of her head, the light touch on my arm when she was explaining something. Each gesture was loaded with meaning, and each time, I questioned whether I should respond or retreat. The more I resisted, the more I wanted to lean in, to feel the warmth of her presence, to be close in that intimate, almost forbidden way. But every step forward carried the weight of responsibility, the unspoken knowledge that this wasn't a game. It was real, delicate, and fragile, and I needed to navigate it with care. By the end of the week, I realized something important. Hesitation wasn't weakness, it was awareness. It was my heart and mind negotiating the complexity of attraction, respect, and longing. And even as I wrestled with it, I couldn't deny the truth that had settled deep in my chest. The pull toward her was irresistible, and I would have to confront it eventually, carefully, honestly, and with the respect she deserved. It was a quiet evening, the kind that feels suspended outside of time. The world beyond the apartment seemed distant, softened by the warm glow of a single lamp and the faint hum of the city outside. I found myself sitting beside her, closer than usual, the tension of days past hovering silently between us. Neither of us spoke at first, we didn't need to. The comfort of shared presence was enough. She shifted slightly, her elbow brushing against mine, and I felt the familiar warmth of her touch. It was a deliberate closeness this time, measured and intimate without being overwhelming. I realized, in that moment, that she had been aware of the unspoken tension for just as long as I had. And somehow, that knowledge made it easier to breathe. She spoke then, softly, almost hesitantly, sharing a thought that seemed as fragile as the quiet around us. "I like how we just fit together," she said. Not in a grand declaration, but in a small, honest acknowledgement of what had been building between us. Her eyes met mine, searching, open, vulnerable. There was no expectation, no demand, just truth laid bare, and it hit me harder than I expected. I felt my chest tighten, and for a moment, I wanted to speak, to explain, to confess the same pull that had been growing in me. But words weren't enough. Instead, I reached for her hand, letting my fingers intertwine with hers, a subtle gesture that carried more meaning than anything I could say. The warmth of her skin against mine, the gentle squeeze she returned, made the tension of weeks dissolve into something softer, more certain. She leaned slightly into me, and I noticed the faint rhythm of her breathing, the quiet steadiness that mirrored my own. There was a sense of safety in that closeness, a feeling that nothing needed to be rushed or forced. We sat together in silence, letting the comfort of proximity speak for itself. Her head tilted just enough that her hair brushed my shoulder, and I felt a quiet joy in the simplicity of the moment. The conversation that followed wasn't about confessions of love or dramatic declarations. It was about understanding each other. She spoke about her experiences, her fears, and the quiet hope she carried for connection. I shared my own hesitations, the doubts and questions that had haunted me since that first unexpected touch. And through it all, there was no judgment, only a growing trust, a sense that this bond we had nurtured could exist honestly, respectfully, and beautifully. By the end of the evening, the tension between us had shifted. It wasn't urgent or desperate anymore, it was steady, tender, and mutual. Every brush of fingers, every shared glance, every small, deliberate movement was a promise of connection without words. The attraction was acknowledged, the boundaries respected, and yet there was an undeniable intimacy that made the ordinary extraordinary. In that quiet, lamplit room, I realized that this was the moment the story had been leading to, the point where mutual understanding replaced hesitation, where the slow burn of attraction found clarity in emotional truth. And in that understanding, I felt a warmth that was more than desire. It was connection, trust, and the beginning of something quietly, profoundly meaningful. The following evening, I found myself back at my friend's apartment, but this time it felt different. The air wasn't just filled with casual conversation or background noise, it carried a quiet intimacy, the kind that lingers after shared understanding. She was there, naturally radiant as always, yet softer somehow, more approachable, as if our recent conversations had pulled down invisible walls. We settled on the couch together, a blanket draped over our legs, and for a long while, we didn't speak. The quiet wasn't awkward, it was comforting. Her head rested lightly against my shoulder, the warmth of her hair brushing my arm. I felt the faint rise and fall of her breathing, steady and calming, and realized that these small, unremarkable moments were the ones that carried the most weight. Each touch, each glance, was an affirmation of connection, mutual respect, and unspoken trust. As the evening progressed, our conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything and nothing. We laughed softly at shared memories, exchanged teasing remarks, and paused occasionally to simply look at each other. There was no rush to define what we were, no pressure to label the connection, just a recognition of the bond we had cultivated. The simplicity of it felt extraordinary. I became aware of the subtle ways she sought closeness. The way her hand brushed mine when she reached for a snack, the small tilt of her body toward mine when she laughed, the way her eyes lingered, full of curiosity and warmth. Every gesture was deliberate yet gentle, a continuation of the slow burn intimacy that had begun weeks ago. And I responded naturally, allowing my own body language to mirror hers, leaning in, fingers brushing hers, shoulders occasionally touching. There was a rhythm to it, an unspoken dialogue of trust and affection. At one point, she shifted slightly to look at me, her lips curving into a soft, knowing smile. It wasn't a declaration, not in words, but it conveyed everything that mattered, the acknowledgement of mutual attraction, the acceptance of emotional closeness, and the comfort of being truly seen. I returned her smile, feeling the quiet satisfaction of knowing that we were both aware of the connection we had nurtured, and that it was safe, respectful, and real. Time seemed to slow as we sat together, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence. The ordinary living room, with its soft lighting and quiet background hum, became a space that felt private and significant. I realized that the attraction I had felt from the first casual touch, the first lingering glance, had transformed into something deeper: connection, understanding, and a subtle, enduring intimacy that didn't need urgency to feel meaningful. As the night drew to a close, she leaned back slightly, resting her head once more against my shoulder. I felt the weight of the moment, gentle and grounding, and I knew that this was the resolution we had been building toward. No grand gestures were needed, just quiet, shared warmth, and the knowledge that the bond we had formed was real, cherished, and safe. In that simple, lamplit room, with her presence beside me, I felt a profound contentment. The slow burn had reached its gentle peak, leaving us connected, understood, and at peace, a story of attraction, trust, and age-gap romance resolved with tenderness, restraint, and heart.